How are we? We well? Good? Happy? And how are we enjoying the Odyssey? Yes, we're getting stuck into it now. We're actually making progress. And this is very exciting because today marks the end of the Telemachiad, Telemachus's adventures. And I was just reflecting on this as I was driving in, as how the narrator has managed to get, if you like, a free thrill out of nothing. The narrator is going to tell us the story about Odysseus, and I can't wait to meet him. You know, if we'd met him in line one, book one, we wouldn't have had that kind of thrill because that's where you expect a story to begin. But instead, the poet has kind of held Odysseus back. And I don't know if you noticed, but book four, and I don't know if this is the poet's intention, we can't possibly guess that, but book four doesn't half go on compared with the previous books. And you kind of, you know, you get to line 500 or something and you think, well, I must be, and then you flick forward a few pages and go, God, there's more of this. But it helps, I think it helps to build up the tension that, you know, we sort of know that Odysseus is in the offing, and we know that the crisis at home is building, which of course is the main, I guess you'd say the main purpose of the Telemachiad, is to build up this sense that there's a sense of foreboding that it's urgent that Odysseus gets home, because otherwise, you know, 20 years, 19 years, 21 years, get home when you can and we'll sort things out. But no, this is coming very much to a head. So what I propose to do today is, as we're settling into the rhythm now, which is to review what we have read in the past fortnight, which is, unless I've terribly miscalculated and told you something different, book 4, and preview book 5. That's good. Okay, we're on the same pages. Excellent. So would anyone care to venture some thoughts about book 4, general observations or specific questions, or specific observations and general questions, whatever you like?
I'm struck, and I actually went back and looked at this, but I was struck by how much Telemachus has grown. And there are lots of examples, but for instance, he is spoken to, you know, speaks to, so in book 4, he's a contador of Menelaus. And when he was about to meet Nestor 2 books ago, he was saying to us, oh, I can't do this, you'll have to go first. So, you know, his ability to actually operate effectively in the ruling echelons of Greece. Really, come on.
Yeah, did others feel that sense of his development?
Yeah.
I think it's a great observation, and that, of course, is the poet's trying to balance the two things. If Telemachus is the equal of Odysseus, welcome Rhonda when she arrives. Welcome, Rhonda. Are there? Yes, if Telemachus is the equal of Odysseus, you don't need Odysseus. If he's the inferior of Odysseus, he's not going to be much help. So the poet needs to show that he's got the potential, but that there is still room for him to grow. And we'll see this kind of come to a crescendo when, spoiler alert, because the poem does tell us what's going to happen. It's not really a spoiler. We see this, that Telemachus, there's a moment when he almost eclipses his father, and Odysseus has to kind of sort of step in and say, step back, son, I'll take it from here. But you got the real sense that if he wasn't there, Telemachus would be up to the challenge. So that's a great part of what's going on here. What else? Other feelings, observations about the book? What do we make of her as a woman? I suppose would be because she's a player in her own right. Talk to that, Rena.
You don't really understand her motivations, but she's a very strong person, obviously. And she says to Menelaus, oh, but sorry, that was when I was a whore, you know. Yeah. Going off with Paris. And doesn't seem to be too ashamed of it. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So that's why I think she's got her own agenda.
Yeah. I don't know how much of this you're able to pick up, Rhonda. I hope you.
Yes, I heard that.
Excellent. Good. Yeah, it's interesting because she gets to tell a story about her memories of Odysseus, and that casts her in a particular light. And then Menelaus jumps in with his own story that kind of tells a rather different kind of story about who Helen is and what she represents.
So she seems almost as tricky as
Yeah.
really.
She's a little bit like Proteus in that sense, in that she's adaptable, and like Odysseus, and indeed like Penelope. You know, that sense of being able to use your wits to survive. And you know, you have to say it was very much a man's world. And if you were a woman with that lack of agency and you weren't able to make the most of your situation, you quickly get chewed up and spat out. The myths themselves kind of can't quite make up their mind about Helen, because there is a myth that the Helen that arrives in Troy is like an avatar, is not the real Helen, that the gods have created a sort of pretend Helen, and that Helen has been spirited off to Egypt, which is presumably some kind of way of keeping her absolved of the blame. And you know, when if we think about what happens back in Sparta, so to review again, Paris gets promised by Aphrodite, the most beautiful, promised by Athena, the most beautiful woman in the world. So the gods have already decided that Helen is going to become Paris's. So in that sense, how can she be blamed for something that's outside of her control? So that's what's happening at one sort of level. But at the kind of the mortal realm, Paris arrives in Sparta, is the guest of Menelaus, and we've already seen how important that relationship is, and how kind of sacred, and what a terrible taboo it is to break that code. Paris gets to meet Menelaus and Helen. So it's a little bit like this story, but 20 years ago, when they were young and still madly in love with each other, and they hadn't experienced all of this. Menelaus makes the mistake of taking off somewhere to go and conduct some business elsewhere, leaves Paris alone with Helen, and the next thing you know, Paris has taken off with Helen and half of Menelaus's riches and headed off to Troy. It's never quite clear, it's never specified what role Helen plays in that, whether she is basically kidnapped. You know, in our kind of framework, we'd say that she's sexually assaulted and kidnapped, so she's a rape victim, or whether she's wholeheartedly engaged in this, or whether it's because the gods have already decreed it. She really doesn't have much say at all. So that kind of essential ambivalence, ambiguity about Helen, I think is very well captured in this episode.
I think that Helen's playing human god. She's just having fun. Why can't you do the same? And then, because when she sort of laments about, when she gets over there, then she sort of gets homesick. And then she says, I was forced here. So I think she's enjoying it. You know, I think she's a spirited lady.
Yeah.
That I don't feel that she's a victim in any sense of the word. I think she knows how the dice roll. I really do.
I think she survives because she's so beautiful. Because I'm just wondering, normally women don't have much control of agency. Take the word agency, they use now. And I think you're right. It's just because she's so beautiful and she uses that personality to forget the past and just get on with it.
Yeah, I don't think she's a whim. I think she's like you.
Forced to be around.
Yeah,
And also,
but he can't quite put it that way in the book because he can't outshine his heroes or something like that. So she comes across as sort of, you know, a semi-dull shield, but she's having a good time. Well, I think she is.
isn't she also the daughter of Zeus? Didn't Jess, that business with the swan and everything,
Yeah.
sort of a bit vague in my head, but.
Yeah, she is,
So she's half divine anyway.
yeah,
He led his daughter.
yes.
Yes, the
Right.
swan.
She's whose daughter?
She is,
Leader.
Oh, Leda the Swan, yeah.
so she is the daughter of being raped by a swan,
Yes.
which is a funny way to come into the world. But I mean, just reflecting on that, yes, her extraordinary beauty in a sense is what keeps her safe or gives her the possibility of a future. But I wonder too if it kind of distorts her behavior, because if, you know, a little bit like a Hollywood star,
Yeah.
if everyone around you is falling down
Yeah.
and worshipping you and telling you you're great all the time, then you probably can't help yourself end up manipulating and taking advantage of that situation.
And it's also an interesting counterfoil against Penelope. Penelope's very strong in her role, but she doesn't come forward as being really forthright, but she is in her own way. She's managed, God, 20 years of keeping the secrets at bay, and she weaves during the day and unpicks it at night. And so it's quite a interesting contrast.
Yeah.
And it does also make us wonder, which is something we know almost nothing about the transmission of the poem and how it was delivered and received in the, seems like it may have been 300 or 400 years as an oral tradition, whether it was delivered, there's some thought that it might have been delivered at religious festivals, that it would be kind of the high point of the entertainment. And it's too long to be delivered in a single go, so it might be over 3 days, or maybe a section of the story is told by the poet. But we don't know for sure if women were present at those events, and if so, what their role was, and I obviously can't speak as a woman. I don't even identify as a woman, so I'm not able to.
It's not you're not in touch with your female side.
But it does seem to me that given how controlled and how lacking in, sorry to use the word, agency women are, I think the portraits of Helen and Penelope and to a lesser extent of Calypso and later of Circe are extraordinarily kind of complex, and Athena as well. They're very you know, it's hard to make up have a fixed view about them.
Do you think that's because I mean, what you're saying is interesting, and I've read that too, that the women didn't go to the theatre and so on. Could it be these are views of women by men? You know, like a male, these are the kinds of women we have, and so it's there. So that's perhaps why they're so confused a bit, because they're not, you know, because they're looking at women as not like themselves, not like themselves.
Yeah.
Apparently, it takes the suitors 3 years to work out. But Penelope is unweaving, and they don't work it out. Actually, one of the women betrays her, and tells, because you know what's going on, and they go, "Oh yeah, oh I hadn't thought of that." Oh, God, how blind can you possibly be? And that's almost like a joke about men's inability to kind of.
Switch on. Can I just digress back to that comment that you made? You saying that Helen, because she was beautiful, was like a rock star. But aren't the men exactly behaving the same way? Like every time they turn up, they're a rock star.
They look like a god.
Yeah, you know, like when they go, you know, meeting and you know, even if they come in calmly, it's all like I'm this and I'm that. So you know.
Can I just make a little point? A couple of times I read, you know how they go about, there's always Dawn as a lady, and she's always said the same thing. When the men arise, especially when they've been anointed, you know, the bath and what have you, they put their shoes on, they always have smooth feet. And I was quite fascinated with this, and I wondered whether it was because they wore shoes and the average peasant was out in the you know, in the ground, the hills, their shoes weren't smooth, and their feet were all crusty. I was just curious, but they mentioned it a couple of times. I thought,
I think Telemachus put sandals on though.
yeah, but he has smooth feet.
Yes, because I suppose they get oiled all the time by all
Yeah,
these
and they're
women
not,
who
he
keep
doesn't
oiling
do any really hard work.
them.
But no, they shouldn't. Like
I just
he
thought
has
that
to
was
have
fascinating, but you know, they talk about it always looks like a god.
Yeah.
But they don't say much about hands. A couple of times they've mentioned the smooth feet.
There's that thing with Mary or someone washing Jesus or oiling Jesus' feet. So it must be so much the thing, you know, if you don't have normal or what we consider to be usual ablution facilities, that your feet probably get quite red.
Yeah.
Especially if you're wearing sandals, so you would be looking after them all the time. So it would be a point of
I've seen it about 3 times. Oh,
yeah.
sort of in his feet. And the other thing, when I was reading about Menelaus, he said, you know, he says he's quite wealthy. It took him 7 or 10 years to get his wealth. But he was out in his ships. It sounds as if he plundered.
Yeah.
To me, and that's how they got wealthy.
Well, certainly the Greeks at Troy were plundering up and down the coast. I mean, you can't lay siege to a place for 10 years without despoiling the entire area. And there's several references to Odysseus kind of doing that, and it wasn't considered lowly. It was just, you know, you took what you could get. It's kind of going back to what we were talking before about the different roles of men and women. I mean, I think the difference is that men can be just straightforwardly whatever they want to be. Achilles is furious. He doesn't have to hide that fury or anything. He's just got a bigger sword and he's a better fighter than the boss Agamemnon, so he's furious. A woman doesn't have that opportunity, if you know that. So, and they're fighting over a woman, a slave girl, that basically Agamemnon said, "Well, I've been deprived of my spoil, so I'm going to take yours, Achilles." And Achilles obviously regards this as a huge blow to his honor. But besides, this slave girl is just kind of handed around like booty. So she's got no, again, to use that word, agency. She can't do anything about any of this. So, and she obviously doesn't have even the opportunities that Helen and Penelope have. But as limited as they are, Helen and Penelope are making the best of, I guess, the best of a bad hand.
It's funny, I don't look at them as being limited. It's really weird,
I think that there are constraints on them. I think they've got agency, either because of their position or because of their beauty. But I think they're still constrained by their position in society. The bit that struck me was Penelope's reaction when her son sailed off without telling her, and I thought that this is the universal parental experience. When the child, when they've sort of grown up, they do something that she didn't know about or you don't approve of. So that struck me, and you know that goes on for a number of pages how overwhelmed she was by him making a decision.
And she can't go and get him. We never see her outside of the Megaron, outside of the palace.
Yeah.
And in the same way, Helen, we only ever see her within the walls of Troy, in that palace with Paris, or back here with Menelaus. She could not go and visit as Menelaus does and leaves Paris and Helen alone, you know, so ill-advisedly. The women could not possibly do that. They couldn't travel independently. And when Agamemnon, if you remember, Agamemnon's return home is often referred to as a kind of cautionary tale in the Odyssey because he gets slaughtered by Clytemnestra. Well, he turns up with with Cassandra, who is one of the women from Troy. And, you know, had he got a better reception, he basically have said, "Oh, by the way, she is another one of my wives now." You know, so that we would consider to be a very different kind of existence than women would expect to put up with these days.
And a line count would actually give you a pretty quick idea of how important the women were. If you counted up the number of lines in the poem that are women speaking, or the women's exploits being described, as compared to the men, what, 100 to 1? At least 10 to 1. So that even when they've got they've got bit parts, and you know they're interesting bit players, but they're never that main action. Except I guess Helen could be seen as being the trigger of the
I don't disagree with that, but I still think just a whole war was waged for women. So just that sentence or that whole thing is so incredibly unrealistic. So to say that there's so many contradictions in it, to say that they, like you said, they couldn't travel, but maybe they didn't, but it doesn't mean they didn't have spies, maids and everything. I don't think they were just the way that, I think sometimes we're putting them in boxes or something. I don't think I'm reading too much into it, but you think a whole war was waged over a woman. No, you know, and things like this. And yes, they don't have so many lines, but that makes them more intelligent, not stupid, because most people dribble about, you know, the way women talk, etc. So I think the poem in some ways is constructed quite finely in how it represents, even though it is probably, you know, a male's perspective. And I still wouldn't underestimate the women, and just because they're, you know, only having small parts doesn't mean they can't manipulate or do things or don't have significant say or impact.
But there's a difference between manipulating and being the front runner, where you make the big decision.
Being empowered by your own.
Yeah. You know, you can manipulate within the constraints of your position or your duty or whatever it is, but you know, you can't necessarily change the world. I know that war over common may be different. It's driving my argument.
But the thing about the war over Helen, it's not entirely about Helen.
Exactly.
You know,
Male egos.
it's about, yeah, male egos and honour and another excuse to go adventuring.
Yeah.
You know, it's,
And also
Helen's
a
just-
provocation,
and the problem,
you know,
yeah, that's
that
right.
if you let this lie, then it reveals that you don't
Yeah,
have the power
that's quite
that you
political,
pretended that you
really.
had.
Yeah.
Ask about communication, because I'm just listening to all this. Like, Odysseus goes off and no one knows where he is, so there's nothing like mobile phones, anything like that. So how do they get there? There seems to be a lot of, there's a lot of islands around Greece, and there would seem like it's city-states. How do they actually communicate? Do you know? Because I remember going to France many moons ago, and was near one of the main rivers, and they had this sort of exhibit about the people who lived there, you know, prehistoric, and they used to talk to each other with like mirrors down the river. So did they have travelling bards who used to come by boat? I mean, how did they know there was a war going on in Troy when they're in Ithaca? That's what I'm trying to ask. Or did the gods just know? Did the gods manipulate them?
Well, we know there was an awful lot of trade going on around the Mediterranean and beyond.
Right.
So obviously that would have carried information
Yes,
around, but that you know, its primary purpose was not to communicate with other states. But no doubt, when the ship gets in with its store of copper or whatever it might be, or olive oil, you'd be rushing to know what have you heard, what's happening. But I mean, if we think about Nestor and Menelaus, they don't seem to know anything at all about what's happening on Ithaca. They don't know Telemachus, and that's not really, as you know, if you look at the map, they're not really very far away at all. They're overseas or over the sea, but they're not very far away, and they don't seem to have any idea.
How did they know to go to war in Troy against Troy? Do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, no, that is a good question.
It was a mass army. It wasn't just.
Yeah.
Because if Menelaus went, he's from one island. Odysseus went, he was from another island. Then there was all these other people who was traveling. And there was sort of, and there's a general word for the Greeks. They don't call them Greeks, they call them Artians or Archaeans.
Achaeans.
Archaeans, that's sort of general. So how did they communicate? Was it just over a period of time?
I don't know.
Up to messengers.
One little man in the boat.
Messenger, I mean, the famous messenger in a marathon.
Yeah.
Yes, they said a messenger,
Yes.
that's from point A to point B.
And that
Runners.
was several hundreds of years after this. And
Yeah, but
Still
still be the
was,
same sort of
yeah.
thing.
Trickier when there are islands involved, though.
Not really, because you just, like when you visit Greece, you just island hop. You know, you get the.
I don't think they had ferries back then.
They were rowing.
Yeah. much they travel, the trade and everything.
No, I'm not, but
everything.
I think
And food, supplies. Look, some of the islands are very, very barren, so they would have to bring in nearly everything, everything. So the trade would be daily in some places.
Deborah?
Like it wasn't suitable for horses.
Yeah, no,
So
it's not.
So it wouldn't be suitable for probably growing wheat. So
No,
they would probably have to import.
they do.
Yeah.
And see, Turkey's and Italy and other places, they're quite rich, so they would just come across, and it's like to go from Kos to Bodrum is, you know, only a few hours and things like that. You just get in those little boats. It's not the big ferries. It depends on how far you want to go. It's only a few hours. You know, it's not like,
in terms of this time,
yeah,
it's still hard. The marathon thing, yes, because you can get your chain of runners and they keep running, but you know, when you say, well, I need you to go from this island to that island, yeah, okay, I'm on my own. Do I make a boat? Do I?
No, they would have been people with boats. I mean,
Yeah, they were a seafaring nation.
that's right.
Yes, they were
What
constantly.
if I want it to be secret?
Oh,
Secret
sure.
messages, you know.
go at night.
Disguise yourself and go, no.
Well, we may have to park that one because we really don't know the answer to that, but we do know there was an awful lot of trade at the time. And there is a theory that part of what underlies the structure of the Odyssey, because Odysseus wanders around islands having adventures, is that it reflects some of the trade routes of either of the time that the poem was written down or in the oral period, the several hundred years beforehand. I just remembered an interesting historical tidbit, which is that Samuel Butler, the 19th century novelist, wrote a book called The Authoress of the Odyssey, which claims that actually the Odyssey was written by a woman. He identifies Nausicaa, whom we're going to meet in book 6, as the authoress of the Odyssey, largely not because of the shrewdness and acuteness of the psychology, but because she makes so many stupid mistakes. He says, like, she puts the prow at the front of at the rear of the ship, you know, all kinds of silly things. She doesn't know how sheep give birth, and you know, those kinds of things. Okay, well, let's
Ask one quick question.
Yeah, sure.
Is there any clue in the name of the word Homer? Like, we know Odysseus means, I can't remember, I mean, Calypso means sheath or cloak or something. You know, they all got names. Does Homer have a name?
That is a good question, and I'll look up.
And does it sort of reflect the fact that it may not be one person, but like a symbol of many orators, storytellers? So.
Yeah,
I was
no,
just
that's
curious.
really good.
Was Homer blind?
That is a tradition. There's no evidence for it at all, but it's based on the fact that we meet a singer or a rhapsode in the Odyssey who is blind. So it's sort of thought that it's a little bit like, you know, Homer putting a portrait of himself in the story.
Oh, I see. Oh,
But there's no real evidence. There's no real evidence for anything to do with Homer at all. There's various different islands in Greece claim that Homer came from there, but there's no real evidence for it. All right, let's just kind of work our way through book 4, and just, if there are parts that you've noted because you wanted to talk about, then please shout out. Don't let me just crash on, because I certainly don't think we want to hear a monologue from me for an hour.
means. Homer, that's what the name means.
So if you like, Telemachus has already found an ally. He's been sent with Pisistratus, the son of Nestor, to go and see Menelaus and Helen. So if you like, he's already doubled his strength. And when they get there, they find that there's a wedding feast going on. Now, you might speculate about what this is about, but from a sort of narrative point of view, one of the things it's doing is talking about the fact that Menelaus and Helen, it's, as I said in the email, it's complicated. They've got history together. Their union was clearly fractured very badly for 10 years, and there are plenty of indications within the text that it's like any bone that heals. It doesn't heal exactly the way that it was before. It's been affected by what's actually happened. So you get mentions of a wedding feast, the marriage, a bride. Although once that's kind of done its job, the poet kind of just chucks that in the corner. We don't hear about it again. It's almost like an authorial device. Anything anyone wants to point out in the first few lines? Clearly, Telemachus is awestruck by the magnificent place, line 50 or so, struck by the sight, they marvelled up and down the house of the warlord dear to Zeus. Oh, by the way, I think I mentioned in the email that the manservant or the servant who sees them doesn't automatically know to do the right thing. He goes and says to Menelaus, "What are we supposed to do with these two?" And Menelaus gets furious like any redhead. He's got a fiery temper. And as I said, maybe there's some kind of sense that the last time that they let people in, it was Paris who walked away with the queen. So maybe it's not an automatic right anymore. I don't know. We say at line 68 or so, the usual custom, once you've dined, we'll ask you who you are. So the hospitality is not conditional on knowing whether this is the son of a friend or an enemy. You're going to look after that person, which may have been another, talking about communication and travel, that will have been another constraint on traveling between islands, because unless you'd already established this guest-host relationship, you were dependent upon that being respected. So you didn't have, you couldn't go and go and stay at the Ithaca Hilton. You know, there was no such thing. All right, now there was
But also the servant couldn't really invite them in on his own, could he?
No.
You know, he had to get the queen to say, "Oh, come in."
Yes, yeah. So, you know, the servant is getting shouted at for perhaps doing the right thing. So at line 100, again, we're always sensitive to these stories called the nostoi, which is the returns, the stories about the getting home of all of the warriors from Troy, not the foot soldiers, nobody cared about them, but the kings, the princes, how they got home and what their reception was like. So at line 100, while I roam those lands amassing a fortune, a stranger killed my brother, blind to the danger, duped blind, thanks to the cunning of his cursed murderous queen. So there's a kind of coded message there that, you know, Odysseus does not know what sort of a welcome he's going to get when he gets home. He doesn't know what the situation is. He doesn't know whether Penelope has stayed faithful. He believes that she has. He has faith in her, and that is rewarded. But that is a matter of faith rather than of knowledge. And at line 109, he says, "Well, would to God I'd have stayed right here in my own house with a third of all that wealth and they were still alive." So he wouldn't give up all of his wealth for them still, including his brother, but he'd give up, you know, a fair proportion of it. And a third of a magnificent hoard is still worth quite a bit. You know, I don't think we need to feel too sorry for Elon Musk if he's lost his wealth. We shouldn't be getting a GoFundMe up for him, I don't think. And that kind of prepares the way for us then to begin to start hearing about Odysseus. None of those comrades, pained as I am, 916 or so, do I grieve as much as for one, that man who makes sleep hateful, even food, as I pore over his memory. No one, no Achaean, laboured hard as Odysseus laboured or achieved so much. And how did his struggles end? Well, that's a kind of an ominous way to put it. How did his struggles end? In suffering for that man. For me, in relentless, heartbreaking grief for him. So I want to get to these lines. This is just summarizing where we're going with this, but we'll skip that. These lines, lines 126 to lines 130. Such memories stirred in the young prince a deep desire to grieve for Odysseus. Tears streamed down his cheeks and wet the ground when he heard his father's name, both hands clutching his purple robe before his eyes. So I think I might have just given the game away with the slide, but there is one particular word there that, unless you actually kind of know the context, it doesn't make any particular impact on us. And that is this word purple. Does anyone know a little bit about the colour purple?
It's the dye that's very difficult to find.
It comes from the shells, doesn't it?
It comes from, yes, indeed. The myth is that Heracles was walking along the beach with his dog, and the dog chewed at one of these shells, as you can see on the screen up there, and came away with purple around his jaws. And that seems to have, that's kind of like an origin story. Where did this purple come from? Well, we know where it comes from. How did we come to discover that you could make purple cloth out of it? So I've got a little note about it somewhere.
Purple has always been very royal,
The Romans, you the same thing, the purple togas were,
But you might think it's just kind of a bit sort of random. Why purple rather than red or something? But like a lot of these things, like spices, like tulips, things that we take for granted now. That if you wanted to buy a purple garment, that would be the same price as a yellow one. You wouldn't think that you'd be paying extra. But there's a reason why purple is so special, and that's because it is so damn difficult to make. And it also has some interesting properties because apparently, I'm going to show you a little video in a second, which I have made, but which kind of talks about this. Tyrian purple, it's thought to have been developed by the Phoenicians. And Tyre was one of their cities. So Tyrian purple is purple that comes from Tyre. But apparently purple that is made in this way, as it gets older and weathers, it gets more intense. It doesn't lose its color. It gets more vibrant. These are the Murex shell. Let me Murex. So let's go to a video. I can get it to. Now, I've been having trouble with the sound this morning, which I don't think is going to come from the television. I think it's going to come from the laptop, and I hope that you're going to be able to hear this, Rhonda.
Making authentic Tyrian purple dye starts here, with extracting a Murex snail gland. It takes nearly 45 kilograms of these snails to produce a single gram of pure Tyrian purple extract. It's a painstaking and pungent process. And the result? This single gram of dye that can fetch nearly $3,000. By comparison, 5 grams of a synthetic version sells for under $4. Tyrian purple can be used to dye clothes or create paints. In the ancient world, it was so rare that only royalty could afford to wear clothes dyed with it. Even today, at such an astronomical price, Tyrian purple pigment is mostly a collector's item. So, what makes real Tyrian purple so hard to make, and why is it so expensive? This is Mohammed Ghassan Nouira. He's been making Tyrian purple dye in his home in Tunisia for 15 years. Today, Ghassan is one of a handful of producers in the world bringing this ancient dye back to life. Ghassan learned how to make this dye through an excruciating process of trial and error. Because there's no instruction manual, he reconstructed the techniques he uses from 1st century texts.
Oh my god, I must say that I have gone through a lot of failures. The historical texts about the process of making Tyrian purple are very rare and are quite vague, so you have to start everything from scratch and learn everything on your own.
To make the extract, Ghassan must navigate a complex process, and it's this extensive labour that accounts for much of the final price. The part of the Murex snail that contains the pigment is called the hyperbranchial gland.
The good thing is that the gland is located right under the shell, which helps a little bit in the extraction.
It's the only part of the snail used to make Tyrian purple, and each gland contains only a few drops of pigment. But before he can extract the gland, Ghassan has to wash, scrub, and sort the snails by size.
You don't really want all of this mud and sand to interfere with the dye when you crush the shell and expose the gland. So this is the first step, and it's a very important step. You really have to clean your snails very, very well.
Russin can now extract the gland from the clean snails. If he hammers each shell too lightly, it'll take too long. But if he hits it too hard, he'll crush the gland. It took Russin 2 years to learn how to do this efficiently.
And of course, the snail is not wasted, then it will be cooked for dinner. Everything is basically recycled.
To make the extract, Russin first macerates the fresh glands in cold water and lets them ferment in an airtight container. Once the glands release their colourant, Russin gently washes and filters the mixture to separate the dye from the flesh. This is the first of 6 separate rounds of purification necessary to make a pure Tyrian purple extract. Now Russin can dry the pigment mixture. He applies it to a sheet of glass and lets it dry under the sun. He uses glass because it won't absorb any of the valuable pigment.
So these glands have been drying for 3 days. They are half dry now. They're still malleable, as you can say. This is the pure colorant, or more or less pure.
Once the pure colourant mixture is dried, he scrapes it off the glass with a razor, making sure to get every last bit.
And the whole process, from the liquid colorant up until the dried pure powder, the whole mass will have lost at least 98% of its weight.
The dry pigment is now purified 5 more times in a grinding and sieving process to remove any detritus. The nearly 100 pounds of murex snails are finally transformed into 1 gram of pure Tyrian purple extract. And acquiring enough snails is another challenge, an expensive one. Russin can spend hundreds of dollars sourcing the snails he needs for his dye. That's because finding these snails requires experienced fishers. One of the fishers Russin works with is Salim Ben Milad. He harvests murex snails from Solomon Beach. Like Russin, Salim and his team have perfected their technique over time.
بالطبيعة لهنا صعيب تحديد المواقع برشا تحت الماء، راهو البحر كبير برشا كما تعرف البحر كبر ويلزمك تعرف البقايع وتقمر يعني وتشد في مخك. وحتى في الأحجار يعني تحت الماء فما أحجار معين يحبوا.
It can take Salim 4 hours to find the right snails, or he can dive for a whole day to no avail.
بالطبيعة أهم حاجة احنا يعني في خدمتنا إنه يبدأ المناخ باهي يعني وطقس مزيان احنا نقولوا وراكح ويبدأ الرؤية في الماء يعني تحت الماء باهية يعني واضحة.
The bloodmouth snail is particularly difficult to catch and requires Salim to dive 15 meters deep, which makes it more expensive. And if the weather is consistently bad, the price goes up even more. Sometimes, conditions force Salim and his team to go a whole month without fishing. But it's out of their control.
اللي يستعملوا اللي يطلبوا غسان للبوغرنو هذا اللي خرجنا منه كما اللي شفنا منه طول.
It's dangerous for the snails too, which are highly sensitive to climate change. Since the early 1970s, the population of murex snails has steeply declined due to temperature changes in the water and overharvesting.
We have to be very cautious not to be engaged in overharvesting, to make sure that the small specimens are put back into the sea to preserve the species. So this is why it takes a lot of time.
And careful management of the snail population is vital, as Russin and his divers attempt to revive Tunisia's thousands-year-old dye-making tradition. Russin doesn't use all the fresh snails to make extract. He reserves some to dye fabric directly. This time, he mixes the snail glands with water and a reducing agent and lets them ferment. The mixture goes from a colourless liquid to green before it turns purple. Finding the right pH balance in this step is crucial. If it's too acidic, the wool may burn, and if it's too basic, it may cause the wool to felt.
So now we're just monitoring the pH. It's about 8, which is perfect.
This is also the moment when the soluble dye is the most light sensitive. Russin must cover the dye vat immediately to avoid too much exposure to light. Too much light can turn the dye from purple to blue, destroying a week's worth of work. When the material has soaked for the appropriate amount of time, Russin lifts the vat lid, exposing the mixture to light and air. This allows the mixture to oxidize.
And this is how the color will gradually start to develop.
But one round of vat dyeing won't always do the trick. Like with this silk scarf.
It took me like 8 months to produce, and it required like 800 pounds of fresh snails. And this is still not completed.
And it's not always guaranteed that the colour will come out the same shade.
Historically speaking, there isn't a single hue or shade of Tyrian purple. It's a range of shades that ranges from the color of clotted blood to the color of red purple.
This range is the result of mixing 3 different subspecies of murex snails. Hexaplex trunculus, which produces a violet blue colour, Bolinus brandaris, which secretes the colour of clotted blood, and the bloodmouth, or Stremonita hemastoma, which releases a rich red purple colour. Tyrian purple dye dates back to the Bronze Age and is named after the Phoenician city of Tyre. Some historians believe it was produced as early as the 21st century BC. Ancient civilizations from Phoenicia to the Carthaginian and Roman empires prospered by producing and trading this dye. One of the production sites was Menings, on the island of Jerba, which is now an archaeological site.
لأنها مادة ثمينة جدا، وبما أنها مادة ثمينة فقد قرر الأباطرة الرومان في بداية الإمبراطورية أن لا يقع استعماله إلا من طرف الوجهاء حتى يقع التفريق بين الأشخاص.
A text from the 4th century states that a single pound of Tyrian purple dye costs 3 pounds of gold. But production of this dye came to a screeching halt in the 15th century after the fall of the Byzantine Empire.
دراسة الزيت والزيتونة في أفريقيا الشمالية في القديم، ثم دراسة الأرجوان، هذا صنع الأرجوان المتاجر به، والرخام إلى آخره، كل ما هو علاقة بالتجارة والموانئ.
Ali says he's grateful that Russin is reviving this culturally valuable dye so Tunisians can reconnect with their ancestry. Russin learned about the dye at the age of 14 and was enthralled by its history in Carthage. Over a decade later, he found a murex snail on the shore, oozing purple.
My old passion for red purple came rushing from its deep slumber, and I really had this revelation. And this is how my adventure for reviving this legendary dye started.
Now, he hopes to ramp up his production, offering more shades of pigment.
Well, of course, my dream is to enlarge this project and to create an old-fashioned dye factory and to produce more. But as I said, the main concern should always be to preserve the species, because if there is no murex, there is no dye.
So is that the Mediterranean?
Tunisia.
Tunisia.
Is it on the Mediterranean?
Yes. The top, isn't it? Yeah.
Africa.
I think Tunisia had a huge pearl trade too as well.
I kind of let that run because it kind of gives us an insight in, interestingly, his origin story was exactly the same as Heracles, which is, you see it on the beach and you wonder what about that extraordinary purple. That may be the maddest thing. As a business model, I can't see that it has much of a future, really. But imagine how they would have been, how difficult it would have been to do when you didn't have scuba equipment, if you needed to go down 15 meters, and you weren't able to easily measure the acidity or otherwise of the dye. So it's incredibly precious. So any mention of purple, I mean, I like this because it means you will never see the word purple in this context again without having a whole load of context, which 10 minutes ago you did not have.
Makes saffron look like a complete doll, really.
It does. So,
So if that was the Mediterranean, I'm just checking on Google Maps, it was very calm.
very calm.
Calm compared to book 5, where Poor old Odysseus is hurled from pillar to post.
Oh, you mean the weather, the sea?
The sea.
Yeah, well,
it
it's
was the Mediterranean.
But Poseidon was part of that.
Yeah, but still, I mean, it must have got windy at times. Oh, it must.
They didn't cross Poseidon.
Yeah, so then after this reference to purple, we get the young prince cries around about line 125 or so. We later see his father crying, and he covers his face with his robe, which is something his father does. So it's almost like a kind of a, like father, like son kind of thing. And then Helen makes her extraordinary arrival, emerge from her senti lofted chamber. She's almost like a kind of a goddess.
Yeah.
Late on in the Iliad, when the city is about to be overthrown, there's a scene where two old men, who obviously they're too old to fight, but they've been in this besieged city for 10 years, are moaning and groaning about Helen because she is the cause of all of this trouble, and she passes by and they're kind of struck dumb by her beauty, and they kind of get it. They kind of go, oh, I see why all of these men died for this woman.
The writer lays it on pretty thick. I mean, okay, or the translator with the line structure. Once she's appeared, and then all of the individuals appear, and they get, and it's kind of the rhythm of it is to magnify,
to build her up.
her
Absolutely.
gorgeousness. Yeah.
And I can't quite find the line. It's not really important, but I know earlier Menelaus noticed the similarity of Telemachus to Odysseus, but didn't say anything. Helen has no such qualms. She comes in and says, line
131 was the first.
131. At once, but pondered deeply whether to let him state his father's name or probe him first. Helen has no such qualms. She comes right in and says, to the life, he's like the son of great Odysseus. Surely he's Telemachus.
And I think that's what's really interesting after that is the beginning of the next stanza. Menelaus says, my dear, now that you mention it, like he knows exactly what's going on.
You kind of get the sense of, however smooth her feet might be, who really wears the shoes in this household. So then we get we get a series of things which seem to associate Helen. She is, after all, the daughter of a goddess. She appears to be mortal, but she's kind of semi-divine. But she seems to know things. She seems to have secret wisdom. She knows about drugs. She administers these drugs to kind of take the edge off the grief of the men. And then there is later this story. But before we get to that, again, when you read the Odyssey repeatedly, you begin to get things that the first time around there's no way that you could possibly know. So this, which I quoted in the email, this tactic of Odysseus of disguising himself as a beggar to find his way into Troy, that's not a bad tactic if you want to get in unnoticed. You're one of the invisible. You're one of the homeless on Elizabeth Street kind of thing. That you're just people will step over you and not see you at all. But Helen does, and Helen obviously knew him before, and she managed to get the information out of him.
How did Helen know? Because you said that she didn't leave the palaces. So how did she see? There's so many contradictions sometimes, particularly even with you saying in the strength of the characters, and the culture and the defining roles in male and female. They're constantly broken.
But the background to this is that Helen, having been stolen by Paris under whatever circumstances and taken away to Troy, Menelaus decides on Agamemnon's behalf to get up an expedition to go and get her back. Yeah. So he sends out emissaries to go and get all of the princes from all of the islands.
Yeah, no, but just the individual things saying that.
But I'm directly answering your question. How does she know Odysseus?
No, that wasn't my question. It was more how did she meet Odysseus in Troy? Because she doesn't walk round, because you
Oh, I see, yeah, yeah.
you
No,
actually stated
that's a
the
good
roles
point.
of females,
Yeah.
and I'm not trying to.
Yeah,
you know,
no,
but you say, that's why I'm saying I sometimes don't get it, because you said the roles in the females, particularly the aristocratics, didn't meet the people, they didn't lead the palaces. So therefore, you know, A, B, and C. And then now you're saying, oh, well, in Troy, she was just walking around when Odysseus was walking around as a beggar.
It's not a case of don't let the facts get in the way of a good story.
Yeah.
Which is a saying we use today even, it's there, so that you can bend the truth. And Helen is tricky, yeah. He's trying to prove that the writer's not trying to say something here about Helen and Odysseus. Therefore, they have to meet. Therefore, regardless of the fact that that never would have happened, it still makes a good story.
I don't think so, that's what I have trouble with a lot of it.
Well, but specifically, I did say we never see Penelope outside of the Megapole.
Yeah,
We never see Helen outside of the walls of
yes,
Troy.
yes.
Within the walls of Troy, I guess in a city besieged for 10
You
years.
wouldn't be going down into the plebs area and things like that.
Well, Helen may be something of a special case. She's very much her own woman, but it's a great question that you make. And as I say, I'm not sure whether this isn't necessarily meant to be a documentary in that sense. It's not meant to be historically accurate.
No,
But
but I just feel that there are so many untidy ends.
There are. But we notice that the story that Helen tells shows her off to good effect. She knew what was going on, but she didn't betray Odysseus, and therefore she didn't, give up Troy. Menelaus tells a rather different story about, and this is the first time it never appears in the Iliad, the Trojan horse. That is not where we know about it from. The story ends, the Iliad ends before the city is actually breached. It ends with the end of the wrath of Achilles, if you like, but that's for another day. So this weird story of Helen going around the horse and apparently knowing the voices, and you might ask the same question: how could she possibly know what all of the women of
wives.
She wouldn't have met them. Whatever, but she seems to have this kind of witchy sort of
maybe that's
noise.
it.
And actually, that just reminded me when we were talking earlier about Helen and Penelope and them having to make the best of not being as powerful as men. I realised that she does remind me a little bit of Lady Macbeth in that sense. She's the power behind the throne, and Macbeth is not half the man that she is. But she can't be the king. In the society as it's presented, she can only achieve her ambition through pulling his strings, which she does so well. I realise that my timing is running a little bit off, because we've got to get to the end of this book and then get into book 5 and preview that. So I won't spend a lot of time on this, but we do have this extraordinary story of Proteus, who is the source of this information that we get about Odysseus and the reason to think that there may still be hope for him. Part of what seems to be going on here, we have these stories about Helen's weird powers and Proteus, this kind of shape-shifting being. What it seems to be doing is softening us up for the sort of world that Odysseus has been living in, because he's basically been kidnapped by a goddess, and he is about to have all of these legendary adventures. There are those who think that really what we've got are kind of two stories, two Odysseus, if you like. There's Odysseus, the warrior trying to get home from Troy, which is a very sort of natural, mortal, human story, but also the kind of Jason and the Argonauts sort of, or Heracles kind of, this godlike hero having these heroic adventures against all kinds of monsters who are not like the sorts of things that we see in the world around us right now. So the poet, if you like, is attempting to sew these together by kind of gradually introducing this other world that Odysseus is going to inhabit. And there's we were saying earlier about how much Telemachus has grown. we see that he's got a certain amount of diplomacy around about line 670 or so. He declines the offer of the horses because it's not suited to Ithaca. As someone was saying before, Ithaca is very rocky. It's really not good for horses as well. So, and he praises Menelaus to the skies and says, "Thank you very, very much, but I'll collect a more appropriate gift if that's okay with you on my way back." Actually, he doesn't come back. He comes straight home. But even though he knows that Ithaca is a poor place compared with Sparta, it's his home, and therefore he loves it more than the richest land on earth. We have a similar kind of experience with Odysseus in the next book. And just one final observation before we get on to book 5. Round about line 700, there is another kind of reminder of the coding of what is going on with the guest-host relationship, that whereas the suitors are eating Odysseus's palace, eating Penelope out of house and home, consuming all of those goods, this is how it should be. And now as the two confided in each other, banqueters arrived at the great king's palace. It's obviously BYO, leading their own sheep to be slaughtered and eaten, bearing their hearty wine, which, if you remember, is not quite as difficult as it sounds, because it would be carried in concentrated form and then mixed 20-1 when you're actually drinking it. And their wives in lovely headbands sent along the food, so that it's very much bring a plate. By the way, we arrived in Australia in 1998, and everyone made us feel so welcome. And you can see where this is going. I swear this actually happened to my wife, and I was standing next to her. We were invited to bring a plate. So we rocked up at a friend's house for a barbecue.
With a plate.
Too much confusion and
it's not
calamity. No, it absolutely happened.
So can I ask a question about the reference to what is the old man and the sea?
Yeah,
that
Proteus.
449.
Yeah, so it's called the old man of the sea, is he? Where?
449.
449. So is that the reference that was it Hemingway picked up?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Old
Man in the Sea.
The old man of the sea.
Yeah, I think it's the old man and the sea, isn't it? I think it's just I'm not quite sure what he uses of this, as opposed to just because it's just a man in a boat fishing for sharks. Yeah. And then, if you like, the poet towards the end of the book has the job of getting us back to remind us of the context, to sort of take us back again from Sparta. We've got to get back to know what's happening at Ithaca, and then we're going to go from there to Odysseus. So round about line 700 or so, it's almost like the mention of the banqueters bringing their own gear reminds the poet of what's happening back at Ithaca, where that isn't the case. So he's drawing the contrast, which then allows him to talk then about the suitors, and the fact that they are deceived. They don't know what's going on, which is a really good subtle way of beginning to undermine their power, because at the beginning, poor Telemachus is in tears of frustration because he feels utterly hopeless. But they're not all that smart. You know, it took them 3 years to work out Penelope's ruse. They don't realize Telemachus has taken off with a ship and 20 blokes and gone to see the kings at the other. And they don't know, of course, what that might mean, because it could mean that Menelaus or Nestor will offer to come and you do wonder why they don't actually. Why they say, well, I really care about this guy Odysseus, but good luck with your problems. So I really look forward to hearing how that turns out, as opposed to just sending 100 of their soldiers and going and sorting it out.
But the crucial problem is that Penelope, there's the ambiguity of Penelope's state.
Yes.
So you could kill all of those suitors and that problem's not resolved.
Yes, that's true, and so in that sense, it's Odysseus's problem to solve, because he does both jobs, doesn't he? Yeah, absolutely. No, that is a very good point.
Athena then refer back to Penelope to go back to her father then, and that would resolve that issue. Right back in the early stages, it refers back to.
Does Athena say that?
No, it's not the same.
I think isn't it one of the. It's a good question.
It was the one of the head suitors.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry about that wrong.
Yeah. No.
That would have been resolved instantly within a few moments.
Yeah, but she didn't know that Odysseus was dead or not. That's the point. But,
Yeah.
so if she went and married someone else, she'd actually, you know, and then Odysseus turned up, it'd be a problem. So she's got a waiting game.
So that, you know, at a deeper level, you might think, what if someone
Yeah.
says to you, what is the Odyssey about? One of the things it's about is about identity and, you know, about what's real. Odysseus several times comes up with an autobiography, lies through his teeth every single time, even though there doesn't seem, even lies to his own father. Spoiler alert. He tells a completely invented autobiography. So it's like Odysseus is now almost kind of addicted to not being himself. And there's a point at which he actually makes a pun around that very thing, that his whole identity is not, as with everyone else, wrapped up in their role and in their name, because he doesn't have a role, he's not there, and he doesn't have a name at one particular point. And similarly with Penelope, she doesn't. What is her identity? Is she a queen? Is she a widow? Is it what is the right thing to do when you don't know if you are a queen or a widow? Because you do the right thing for one of those things, and it is absolutely the wrong thing against the other one. If she is a widow, it is her obligation, her duty for the sake of the kingdom, but also for the sake of continuity, to get another husband, because she can't rule, and she needs protection, and the kingdom needs protection. If, however, Odysseus is still alive, then that would absolutely be the wrong thing to do, which is why going home to her father would really not solve it. It's kind of like a simple solution to a complex problem, which would suit them, but really wouldn't solve it. And then we see there's internal discord amongst the suitors. 872, stupid fools, muzzle your bragging now. So they're a kind of a coalition of the unwilling, really. They're all after the same thing, and only one of them can win. So they're not united in that sense. Okay, so we get from the suitors to Penelope, and again there's a misunderstanding. They hear her crying out, and they think, "Oh, great, she's making up her mind." Well, no, that isn't what's going on at all. So we get to the end of book 4. Here the Achaeans lurked in ambush for the prince. So now we've kind of reached the point of crisis. Telemachus is away from home, and he risks being ambushed and killed on his way home, when it would be much easier for them to do so rather than to do it in the palace. So we get 15 minutes or so to begin to look at book 5, which, as I say, is really exciting, because we finally get to meet Odysseus. We find out where he's been all of this time, and we get a real sort of rush of narrative drive. So the thing has really slowed down with the whole Proteus story, and it's like, okay, well, I'm sure this is interesting, but you could have given us 3 lines about where Odysseus is up to, and you could scrap all the rest. But it builds up all of the tension. And again, a little bit like Purple, you look at book 5, as Dawn rose up from bed by her lordly mate Tithonus. That's the kind of thing that your eyes would just pass over, and you think, well, who? I don't know, never heard of him. Let's just move on. But actually, it's a really interesting story and very relevant to the whole book, because Tithonus was the mortal lover of a goddess, Eos. Eos is the god of dawn, so that's why she gets mentioned. That's why he gets mentioned here, because he's associated with the goddess of dawn. But Tithonus is immortal, and as a special favor from Zeus, Eos asks and is granted the favor that Tithonus is made immortal. Be careful what you wish for. What's wrong with being made immortal?
Can't die.
You don't die, but you continue to age. She didn't ask, because she's an immortal, so such things wouldn't occur to her. She doesn't ask that he doesn't age either. So, of course, over the centuries, over millennia, over, all of this time, he shrivels and gets older and older and older. I think this is right, in one of the myths, he's so small that she carries him around in a walnut shell. He's so desiccated. I think that's right. And in another one, he is turned into a cricket. It's like that to put him out of his misery. So the relevance of, all of that is contained in this reference to Tithonus, which of course all of the listeners, all of the readers of the poem would instinctively know that story. But it contains, again, like a kind of coded warning, because we're about to meet Odysseus, and he is being held captive by Calypso. And as someone said before, the name Calypso means someone who shrouds or someone who hides. So he's been hidden away from the world. In one sense, it's kind of like a sort of a useful narrative device to account for 7 of the 10 years that he's been away. Oh, well, he was with Calypso for 7 years. So now we've only got 3 years left to cover. So we're beginning to knock it out now.
And he's sitting on a rock crying.
Sitting on a rock crying, but then he goes home to bed with the immortal, beautiful goddess. Well, yeah.
Yes.
He's smiling through his tears. But, and finally, at line 5, his name comes out. So it's like a kind of a rush of revelation. Finally, we're in the world of Odysseus. And we're back to the Council of the Gods, which is almost like, hang on, we've been here before. But it's like a kind of, what would you call it in a movie? A flashback, where we're kind of, we're being reminded of the context before. And this slightly awkward device, I think, by Athena, who's getting all stroppy, saying, well, that's it then, you might as well there's no point in being a good king, because look what happened to Odysseus. And then Zeus, he uses this line repeatedly. I love it. My child, what nonsense you let slip through your teeth. What are you talking about? You had a plan for him. It was within your control all along. And this is a bold narrative move, I think, because at line 27 or so, we are told Odysseus shall return and pay the traitors back. So it's rather like, what was that movie about someone trying to shoot, was it Charles de Gaulle?
Chirac.
No, there's an assassination movie. We had a French president being shot who was never shot. So you've got the suspense of wondering whether he's going to get shot. Well, actually, you know what the ending is. Sorry, I shouldn't have mentioned that without the context of that. So we know there really is, in that sense, no suspense. So how we get the suspense is because of the things that different people know. Odysseus doesn't know that he is destined to get back. So therefore, for him, it is real peril, and he believes that he can possibly die. So Zeus tells Hermes how Odysseus is going to get home on a makeshift raft that he's going to make for himself. Hermes doesn't mention the raft to Calypso, but Calypso mentions the raft to Odysseus, but she doesn't tell him that Zeus says you're going to get home safe and sound. So it's like there's sort of muffled information going along. And in fact, when you think about, at the moment, Odysseus has got it made in the sense that he has the promise of immortality. Calypso basically says to him, look, you can stay here, you can become immortal. And look at this, look what I've got here, look at all this I've got going on. Penelope can't equal that. She's going to be 20 years older than you last saw her. What will she be like? She's a mere mortal woman. And a little bit like Telemachus saying, look, it's no good for horses, but Ithaca is the best place in the world. Odysseus basically says something similar. And he's got to be very, very tactful, because he can't say to Calypso, yeah, but I love her more than I could possibly love you. He has to say, as gorgeous as you are and everything, still my heart longs to take me home to see my Penelope. So he goes from a kind of having everything that he wants in a sort of material pleasure sense, but not what his heart really desires. And we know that he's going to get more plunder than he could ever have won from Troy at line 43. But in between, he is absolutely reduced to, what's that line in King Lear about man is but a poor bare-forked animal? He's stripped of his, he has nothing, doesn't even have clothes. He is naked, he's just about dead. And it's about how he then, with no resources at all, how he manages to restore, how he manages to get back to regain all of that. Has anyone been reading ahead, or have you been saving it up? Yeah.
Ripping yarn.
It is a ripping yarn. Suddenly we're out of this kind of deadlock, which is very kind of claustrophobic and very sort of scary because it feels like it's about to break. And now it does sort of break. Odysseus is thrown out into the storm. And in fact, I can illustrate this because you can see how the pace accelerates. Over here on the left is what day of the story it is. And over there on the right are the books that we are in. So you see we get to the end of book 4, we're on to day 6. Menelaus tells Telemachus Odysseus is alive, being held prisoner by Calypso. The suitors plot to murder Telemachus. So in book 5, all of this happens. We get from day 7 to day 31. So there's a council of the gods. Hermes goes and tells Calypso. Calypso tells Odysseus. Odysseus builds his ship, sails 17 days towards Ithaca, and is just about safe. Which is not the only time that this happens to him. Just about makes it home. And then Poseidon gets back and realizes what's been going on behind his back and creates this extraordinary storm, which kind of seems to go on when you read it, seems to go on and on and on. And Odysseus is more and more in peril, more and more closer to death. Clinging to the wreckage of his raft, Odysseus washes up on the island of Scheria. And Scheria is, if you like, the beginning of the new world that Odysseus finds himself in, which is this sort of Scheria you will not find, I don't think, necessarily on any map.
It's not on this one.
No, it isn't. But Scheria is where the Phaeacians live. And they live in this kind of almost like a sort of fool's paradise. From one point of view, Odysseus' journey home is like a series of temptations. He's tempted by Calypso, and as I said, in that first line, it gives us a clue, as his instinct is not to become an immortal, because he's aware that be careful what you wish for. That isn't what his destiny is. It isn't what he wants. But he's obviously, it has its attractions to be with an immortal gorgeous princess forever. So that's a temptation. You'll see what the temptation is like with the Phaeacians, because they live this life of, they're isolated from the rest of the world. They don't have that sort of adventures, the sort of adventures that Odysseus or even Telemachus has. They are trapped on their island, in effect. And then Odysseus goes through a series of other temptations or difficulties before he ever makes it back to Ithaca.
So what I noticed reading book 5 was all of a sudden you're in the present tense.
Yeah.
I'm talking, so the story is quite sludgy because so much of the text is people relating what's happened in the past in book 1 to 4. Once you get into book 5, you're on the raft.
And that's a great point, actually. If you like, the beginning of this is after the council of the gods. We follow Hermes across the water. He kind of skims across the water like a bird. So it feels very cinematic to me. You could almost imagine like a drone shot or a helicopter shot along the ocean as Hermes speeds his way, bemoaning the fact that there's no people, no cities here, so nobody to sacrifice to pay worship to the gods. So he feels a little bit kind of deprived. So he then, races towards Calypso. Where we don't find Odysseus. We've been promised Odysseus. He's with Calypso. He gets to Calypso. No Odysseus. Where is Odysseus? So he kind of, even when he appears, he disappears. He's kind of never quite where you expect him to be. But if you like, we've put in the hard work. This has all set up the story and given it a real narrative drive. Now we can really start racing ahead. And things happen. Odysseus meets people and encounters monsters and opposition, and has to kind of find a way of overcoming all of the challenges that face him. Anyone else been reading ahead, wants to give us some thoughts on what we might be about to meet?
Yeah, what struck me was the pace of book 5.
Yeah.
Just how exciting it was.
Yeah.
It was really good. Not that I didn't enjoy 1 to 4, but it was, oh, right, this is really...
It carries you along, doesn't it?
Yeah,
You just think, I'll just keep reading this. Doesn't matter about what I need
Did you get there? Did you get there?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's the guts of the story. It's
Yeah.
actually something's happening rather than dreary history, diarrhea around a
Yeah.
banquet. And whilst, like you said, it sort of is necessary to paint the picture because things did happen. But book 5, yes, thank God. I think if I had to do a few more books, you would have felt lost, I think. It really would have worn your patience.
And it's up to the sense of the peril, why this matters so much. It's not just about whether Odysseus lives or dies. There are other people who are depending on him, and you know, his entire kingdom and his relationship and his son and all of that.
And it makes you respect their capacity for oral transmission, those first 4 books, because they did take quite a while on this, and how well they must have been able to listen and remember, and to be there engaged, to want to know the rest of the story, which pays us up. Yeah.
But and also, I mean, I think that's exactly right. But also this sense that this is a story that's been honed by repeated retelling. You can almost imagine the poet, the oral poet, noticing how it added to the strength of the story when this groundwork was laid. You know, you increase the tension, you increase the delay, you increase the peril.
Yeah.
And then it's not just Odysseus fighting a monster. Well, okay, either the monster wins or Odysseus wins. There's more at stake than that.
But could it be that it's also flexible? Because if you, like you mentioned, they had all understandings of the culture, the sacrificing, the wining and dining, and you know that some gods had impacted this and that, so they had like the whole thing. So I guess in some ways, some of these stories or the chapters, I think, could be told individually, like in short notes to say, maybe the bard would come like to day 1 and travel through, and then if you come back again on day 10, come back and pick up and run with it. Or if you had to do something short and you only had a short engagement, you'd start at book 4. Does that make sense? So some of them can stand alone. They have
it's
some
a great
sort
point.
of strength.
In a future session, I'm going to be talking about Milman Perry, who was the scholar who really changed the way that we think about the Odyssey. And the way that he did it was actually by studying oral story telling. And so he does talk exactly about that, about the fact that you can, because if you remember right at the beginning, the poet says to the muse, start where you like, start where seems the best place to you. In other words, he's kind of saying there's any number of different ways of telling the same story, but there are better ways and there are worse ways. And I guess, as I say, going from village to village or festival to festival, you start to know what your greatest hits are. You know that even if they say, well, we've got 4 hours, that's how much we've got the money together, we can afford you for 4 hours. And he's thinking, I know what's going to knock them out in the 4th hour. So I've got this other stuff that I can lead up to, which I'm going to take some of that. And they've never heard the origin story about the Trojan horse, for example, because that's not in the Iliad. I think I'll do that one tonight. These people look like they would really enjoy that. And that's just me speculating, but certainly the story seems to have been around for hundreds of years when there was no writing, no way of capturing it, and that it has survived. How do we know it survived? Because there are a lot of anachronisms. It talks about bronze, but it also talks about iron. So you kind of got the 2 different cultures. Some, without going into detail, some of the customs about marriage and about, the powers of a king varied at different times. So some of them can be dated to earlier customs that we know about. And even in the Iliad, the armor that they wear seems to be descriptions from several hundred years earlier than when the story is actually written down. So that's kind of how we know it must have existed for this length of time. So there we are.
Thank you.